A small act of kindness can shake open a door no one even knew existed. For Emma Hale, a young waitress at a quiet roadside diner, that door began to tremble the moment a silent little girl started showing up every morning, always alone, always early, always watching the world with the kind of caution children should never have to learn. The diner woke slowly each morning, warm yellow lights humming above chrome counters, the soft clatter of cups stacking, the scent of fresh coffee drifting like a promise of comfort. Emma moved through it with the practiced grace of someone who understood how fragile mornings could be. Her apron was crisp, her hair pinned neatly, her hands steady even when life wasn't. She noticed the girl before anyone else did. Small shoulders slightly hunched under a gray hoodie, fingers curled around a tiny wooden box she kept close, as if it were a lifeline. She never spoke. She just sat at the counter, legs barely reaching the stool's edge, waiting for Emma's gentle greeting. "Early again, sweetheart," Emma said softly one morning, placing a clean cup in front of her. The girl didn't answer, though her eyes lifted a quick, startled glance before retreating into their quiet world. Emma smiled anyway. The girl's silence didn't bother her. Silence could be its own language. Emma poured coffee into a mug for a trucker down the line, the pot warm and heavy in her hand. When she turned back, she saw the girl staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Fear, hope, maybe both tangled together. Then Emma noticed something else. The wooden box on the counter had shifted open just a crack. The diner door opened behind them, letting in a slice of cold morning air. Emma didn't turn at first. She was used to the rush of commuters, travelers, locals drifting in for breakfast, but the atmosphere shifted in a way she couldn't ignore. Conversations thinned, the room fell still, and the warm lights suddenly felt too bright. When she finally looked up, she froze. "Step away from her." Emma held her ground, not out of courage, but out of instinct. The girl's hand had found the edge of her apron, gripping it like a lifeline. "Sir, she's just having breakfast," Emma answered, keeping her voice steady. The man's eyes didn't soften. If anything, they sharpened. "What did she tell you?" he asked. Emma blinked. She didn't say anything. His jaw tightened, as if silence itself was incriminating. 4 men in black suits stood near the entrance, broad-shouldered, impassive, their formation too coordinated to be anything but security. Behind them stepped a man whose presence pulled every eye in the diner toward him. Dark-tailored suit, silvering hair combed with precision, expression carved from stone. He wasn't just important. He was powerful. And he wasn't looking at the room. He was staring directly at the little girl. Emma instinctively stepped closer to the child, her hand tightening around the coffee pot. The girl's breath hitched. She shrank toward Emma's side, eyes wide with a fear that had nothing to do with strangers or crowded places. The man approached the counter slowly, his bodyguards fanning out behind him like a silent wall. The diner felt suddenly too small, too fragile for a moment like this. When he reached them, his voice was low and controlled, a verdict more than a question. "Step away from her." Emma held her ground not out of courage but out of instinct. The girl's hand had found the edge of her apron, gripping it like a lifeline. "Sir, she's just having breakfast," Emma answered, keeping her voice steady. The man's eyes didn't soften. If anything, they sharpened. "What did she tell you?" he asked. Emma blinked. "She didn't say anything." His jaw tightened, as if silence itself was incriminating. The girl's small wooden box slipped open again, just enough for the man's gaze to flick downward, a moment of recognition crossing his features, dark and unmistakable. And in that instant, Emma understood. This wasn't a custody visit. This was the beginning of a truth the girl was too afraid to speak. A truth that had just walked into the diner with 4 bodyguards and a father whose presence felt more like a threat than a reunion. The diner settled into an uneasy stillness as Emma slowly lowered the coffee pot onto the counter, her breath measured and cautious, while the little girl clung to her apron with a desperation that felt far too adult for someone so young. The man in the tailored suit stood only a few feet away, his gaze flicking between the trembling child and the wooden box she kept hidden as though it contained the most fragile piece of her world. His presence distorted the room like a sudden drop in air pressure, and Emma sensed that this was not a simple misunderstanding, but the beginning of something heavy and complex that none of the customers had the vocabulary to interpret. Emma met his stare with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, trying to understand the cold calculation behind his eyes, which revealed a mixture of exhaustion, regret, and something that resembled tightly restrained fear. The girl pressed closer to Emma's side as if she believed that proximity alone could shield her from whatever storm followed this man into the diner. Emma gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, letting her know without words that she wasn't alone, even though she fully understood the complicated risk of standing between a frightened child and a man who moved with the certainty of someone accustomed to authority. The 4 bodyguards remained motionless near the door, forming a silent barricade that prevented anyone from entering or exiting, and their stoic vigilance intensified the tension that already smothered the air. As Emma searched the man's face, she realized that he wasn't angry with the girl, but rather terrified of something he couldn't control, and that fear manifested as cold commands and sharp edges that felt dangerously close to breaking. She recognized the subtle tremor in his fingertips, barely visible as he rested one hand against the counter, and she wondered how long he had been searching for the child and what had pushed her into hiding behind diner counters and quiet mornings. The girl's wooden box slipped open slightly again when her small hand shook, allowing Emma to see more clearly the folded note inside, its corner marked with the same sharp emblem she had glimpsed earlier. She wondered whether it represented a company, a foundation, or something far more personal, considering the man's reaction when he noticed it. She sensed it was not just a keepsake, but a thread tied to whatever fractured this family, and the girl's stubborn grip suggested she did not trust its contents to be seen by anyone but herself. Emma fought the instinct to ask questions, recognizing that this moment teetered on a delicate threshold where a single misplaced word could send everything spiraling beyond repair. The man leaned closer, lowering his voice to a strained whisper as he said that the girl had been missing for days, following a conflict that none of his advisors could repair, and his admission cracked the polished surface of his composure. His confession was delivered with such intensity that Emma felt the truth in it, even though she remained unsure whether his fear was rooted in concern for his daughter or panic over losing control of a situation that threatened his carefully built life. She watched his eyes shift when the girl turned away, refusing to look at him, and she recognized the familiar wound of a parent confronting the consequences of emotional distance. The girl shifted again, tugging Emma's apron with tiny fingers that trembled beneath the weight of everything she could not express, and Emma knelt so that they were eye level, offering the child a moment of grounding amid the chaos unfolding around them. The little girl hesitated, then opened the wooden box fully for the first time, revealing the folded note and a small photograph of a woman whose gentle smile contrasted sharply with the tension choking the diner. Emma saw the man inhale sharply when he recognized the woman, and the girl's hand tightened protectively around the photo as though it held the last piece of comfort she trusted. Emma rose slowly, her posture calm despite the tremor building beneath her ribs, and she told the man with careful clarity that the girl had spoken only one word since arriving. "Please." That single word fell between them like a stone sinking through deep water, and Emma watched something break quietly behind the man's eyes, revealing a weary grief he had been too proud to show. He swallowed hard, stepping back as though the child's silence and that tiny plea carried more judgment than any accusation she could have spoken aloud. The diner's regulars continued pretending not to stare, though their eyes kept drifting toward the unfolding scene, sensing the fragile line between reunion and rupture. Emma felt compelled to protect the girl a little longer, though she knew eventually the truth would demand a confrontation neither of them could postpone. A small act of kindness can shake open a door no one even knew existed. For Emma Hale, a young waitress at a quiet roadside diner, that door began to tremble the moment a silent little girl started showing up every morning. Always alone, always early, always watching the world with the kind of caution children should never have to learn. The girl finally turned her gaze toward her father, her eyes shimmering with a mix of longing and trepidation. And in that single moment, Emma understood that the distance between them was not made of anger but of unspoken pain. Neither had learned how to bridge. The man reached out halfway, stopping himself before he completed the gesture, and Emma recognized that he didn't know if he was still allowed to touch his own child without frightening her further. The girl clutched the photograph to her chest, and the room felt suddenly smaller, as though the entire diner leaned in to see whether this fractured connection could be mended. Emma inhaled deeply, sensing the profound fragility of the moment, and made a quiet decision that would shape everything that followed. She stepped aside only slightly, keeping one hand resting reassuringly on the girl's back, offering stability while giving father and daughter a chance to face each other. The man whispered her name softly, almost reverently, as if he feared the sound might break her, and the diner exhaled in a collective hush as the child slowly lifted her chin, granting him the smallest acknowledgement. A beginning neither expected but both desperately needed. Emma remained beside the girl, sensing the shift in the air as the fragile connection between father and daughter hovered in a suspended moment that could bend toward healing or fracture without warning, and she felt an instinctive responsibility to steady the emotional ground beneath them. The girl's fingers trembled around the photograph, and Emma noticed how her breathing slowed only when she felt the warmth of Emma's hand on her back, a silent reassurance that she was not facing this moment alone. The man stepped forward cautiously, as though entering a space sacred to the child's fears, and his voice softened into a tone that held both apology and uncertainty, revealing a vulnerability he had spent years burying beneath composure. He asked the girl to look at him, his words surprisingly gentle, yet they carried the weight of 1,000 missed moments and unresolved promises that neither of them had the tools to articulate fully. Emma watched the child's expression shift, not into defiance, but into a profound hesitation that showed she remembered kindness and hurt in equal measure, unsure which memory would speak louder. The wooden box remained open between them, acting like an anchor for the girl's scattered courage, and Emma realized that it was not the object itself, but what it represented that kept the child steady. The photograph inside showed a woman whose eyes gleamed with tenderness, and Emma sensed that this woman had been the emotional glue that once held the family together, before something sharp and unspoken shattered the equilibrium, leaving the child stranded between longing and loss. Step away from her. Emma held her ground, not out of courage, but out of instinct. The girl's hand had found the edge of her apron, gripping it like a lifeline. "Sir, she's just having breakfast," Emma answered, keeping her voice steady. The man's eyes didn't soften. If anything, they sharpened. "What did she tell you?" he asked. Emma blinked. "She didn't say anything." His jaw tightened, as if silence itself was incriminating. Though she could not read the entire message from where she stood, she caught glimpses of phrases relating to promises of safety, wishes for hope, and reminders of unconditional love, which explained why the child guarded the note as fiercely as she guarded her breath. The father froze when he recognized the handwriting, and his shoulders collapsed almost imperceptibly under the weight of memories that pressed against him with painful clarity. The diner door opened behind them, letting in a slice of cold morning air. Emma didn't turn at first. She was used to the rush of commuters, travelers, locals drifting in for breakfast, but the atmosphere shifted in a way she couldn't ignore. Conversations thinned, the room fell still, and the warm lights suddenly felt too bright. When she finally looked up, she froze. "Step away from her." Emma held her ground, not out of courage, but out of instinct. The girl's hand had found the edge of her apron, gripping it like a lifeline. "Sir, she's just having breakfast," Emma answered, keeping her voice steady. The man's eyes didn't soften. If anything, they sharpened. "What did she tell you?" he asked. Emma blinked. She didn't say anything. His jaw tightened, as if silence itself was incriminating. The wooden box remained open between them, acting like an anchor for the girl's scattered courage, and Emma realized that it was not the object itself, but what it represented that kept the child steady. The photograph inside showed a woman whose eyes gleamed with tenderness, and Emma sensed that this woman had been the emotional glue that once held the family together, before something sharp and unspoken shattered the equilibrium, leaving the child stranded between longing and loss. The diner door opened behind them, letting in a slice of cold morning air. Emma didn't turn at first. She was used to the rush of commuters, travelers, locals drifting in for breakfast, but the atmosphere shifted in a way she couldn't ignore. Conversations thinned, the room fell still, and the warm lights suddenly felt too bright. When she finally looked up, she froze. The diner remained eerily quiet, with customers pretending to be occupied with their meals, although every ear was tuned to the unfolding moment, sensing a fragile truth unraveling in slow, deliberate strands. Emma whispered to the girl that it was okay to hold the photograph if it brought comfort, and the child nodded faintly before shifting her weight toward her father without fully releasing her hold on Emma's apron. The diner door opened behind them, letting in a slice of cold morning air. Emma didn't turn at first. She was used to the rush of commuters, travelers, locals drifting in for breakfast, but the atmosphere shifted in a way she couldn't ignore. Conversations thinned, the room fell still, and the warm lights suddenly felt too bright. When she finally looked up, she froze. The drawing spoke louder than any sentence the child had been unable to form, and Emma sensed that they were witnessing a moment that carried the weight of both past wounds and future possibilities. The man inhaled shakily, kneeling for the first time so he could meet his daughter at eye level, and he whispered that he never wanted to be someone she felt she had to hide from. The man's eyes darted to the photo and then away quickly, as if the image burned with a truth he had tried desperately to outrun, and Emma understood that the girl's silence had layers deeper than fear alone. The girl opened the folded note with slow, deliberate movements, revealing jagged handwriting that belonged to the woman in the photograph, and Emma instantly recognized the emotional heartbeat pulsing from the words etched onto the paper. Emma felt the shift like a warm ripple passing through the tension that had suffocated the diner for so long, and she watched father and daughter share a fragile, tentative breath that hinted at the first step toward healing. The girl brushed her fingers across her father's sleeve as though testing whether he would remain steady, and his reaction was immediate yet gentle, offering a quiet steadiness that finally aligned with the tenderness she had been longing for. Emma stepped back slowly, giving them space while remaining close enough to anchor the moment in case the child needed reassurance. The father murmured his daughter's name again, this time with a softness threaded with hope, and the girl finally whispered a single word back, barely audible but powerful enough to mend the first broken edge between them. Emma sensed the beginning of something new unfold quietly in that tiny exchange, a fragile reconciliation rooted in truth, vulnerability, and the courage to face a future neither had believed was possible only moments before. The man slowly rose from his kneeling position with a careful grace that suggested he was afraid any abrupt movement might shatter the delicate bridge forming between him and his daughter, yet his gaze shifted almost immediately toward Emma with an intensity that carried far more questions than he had spoken aloud. Emma felt the weight of his attention settle on her, not as a threat this time, but as a burning curiosity, as if he were suddenly aware that someone else had stepped into a role he believed belonged solely to him, and the realization unsettled him in ways he clearly did not expect. The girl remained pressed gently against Emma's side, her small fingers curling into the fabric of the apron she trusted more than the polished confidence of her father, and Emma knew intuitively that the child's reliance on her presence was precisely what drew the man's attention toward her with such sharp focus. He studied Emma's expression with a searching intensity, trying to decipher how a young waitress in an old diner had managed to reach the child he had spent months failing to comfort, and Emma sensed that his confusion came not from pride but from a deeply rooted fear of inadequacy he did not know how to articulate. Emma steadied her breath, aware that the diner's customers continued silently observing every subtle movement between them, and she felt a gentle pressure on her arm as the girl sought reassurance even while inching closer to her father in a fragile attempt at trust. The man watched this shift with visible astonishment, and his eyes flicked toward Emma once more, quietly demanding answers without demanding anything aloud, which somehow felt more powerful than any shouted accusation could have been. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a low hum of restrained emotion, asking Emma how long the girl had been coming to the diner each morning and whether she had spoken about anything beyond her silent gestures. Emma steadied her breath, aware that the diner's customers continued silently observing every subtle movement between them, and she felt a gentle pressure on her arm as the girl sought reassurance even while inching closer to her father in a fragile attempt at trust. He reached out tentatively, brushing the back of his fingers against his daughter's cheek in a gesture so gentle that Emma felt the tension in the child's shoulders ease just enough for hope to slip through. Yet even as father and daughter leaned quietly toward each other, his gaze returned to Emma with a quiet, probing persistence that suggested he saw more than he admitted, and Emma recognized the moment his curiosity deepened into something sharper than mere gratitude. He asked how Emma had convinced the girl to trust her, and Emma replied with simple honesty that she had not convinced her at all. She had merely offered kindness consistently enough for the child to recognize safety when she needed it. Her answer seemed to strike him with unexpected force, and Emma watched a faint flicker of admiration cross his expression before he quickly masked it beneath the controlled neutrality of a man accustomed to showing nothing. The girl tugged lightly at Emma's hand then, asking with a quiet glance if she could hold the wooden box again, and Emma guided her small fingers around the lid with a tenderness that caused the man to inhale sharply, as though witnessing a relationship he had not known how to build for himself. He asked Emma whether the child had ever opened the box willingly for her before, and she nodded slowly, explaining that the girl shared only fragments, always with trembling hesitation, but never out of fear of Emma. The man's posture shifted in a way that hinted at both vulnerability and resolve, and Emma suddenly realized that his questions were not merely about the past few days, but about every moment he had failed to notice his daughter's quiet distress. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as he asked Emma what the girl had been afraid of, not with accusation but with the desperate humility of someone confronting the consequences of his own emotional distance. Before Emma could answer, the girl slipped her hand into her father's again, offering a hesitant gesture that carried more bravery than either adult expected, and Emma saw a new kind of fragile relief soften the man's stern features. The girl glanced between them, sensing a shift she could not articulate, and the man reached for the wooden box with slow, deliberate movements, silently asking permission with his eyes rather than his voice. The child nodded faintly, allowing him to hold the box while keeping one hand wrapped around Emma's apron, as if she needed both connections to feel balanced in a moment so heavy and uncertain. The man examined the box with reverence, tracing the tiny engraved lines along the edges, before lifting his gaze toward Emma again, with a question suspended behind his eyes. He asked Emma how she had known the child was not simply shy but genuinely frightened, and Emma answered that children rarely hide fear with silence unless someone else has taught them to swallow their emotions to survive. Her words struck him with visible impact, and he shifted his stance as though steadying himself against the undeniable truth threading through her explanation. He touched the box gently, confessing in a strained whisper that the girl's mother had been the one who understood her heart, and without her presence he had felt like a stranger in his own home. Emma saw the pain etched beneath his carefully managed exterior, and she realized that his power did not shield him from the helplessness of grief or the terror of losing the one bond he still cherished. When the girl finally reached for her father's hand with a quiet courage, Emma stepped back only enough to give them space, though she remained within reach should the child retreat again. The father glanced at Emma with a look that blended gratitude, curiosity, and a silent plea for guidance, and Emma understood that this moment marked the beginning of a long, complicated healing journey neither father nor daughter could navigate alone. In that fragile space between past wounds and emerging trust, Emma realized she had become the quiet bridge holding both sides steady, and the man's soft acknowledgement of her presence carried the weight of a whispered truth he had not yet spoken. He needed her help, not as a waitress, but as the only person who had managed to reach the child he loved more deeply than he knew how to express. The father held the small wooden box with a trembling restraint that suggested he feared opening it too quickly might scatter whatever fragile secrets remained inside, and Emma noticed how his daughter's eyes followed the movement, with a mixture of longing and dread that hinted at a deeper story. Neither had been brave enough to confront until now. He traced the engraved edges with a slow, almost reverent touch, as though the delicate carvings held memories capable of resurfacing and cutting through the hardened layers he had worn for years. Emma sensed the weight of something unspoken pressing between them, a quiet warning that the girl's silent fear was not born solely out of grief, but from something sharper and more immediate that still lingered around them. The girl stepped closer to Emma again, her small fingers brushing against the waitress's hand in a silent gesture of reassurance for herself, and Emma instinctively tightened her grip just enough to let the child know she would not be abandoned in whatever truth was about to emerge. The father held the small wooden box with a trembling restraint that suggested he feared opening it too quickly might scatter whatever fragile secrets remained inside, and Emma noticed how his daughter's eyes followed the movement, with a mixture of longing and dread that hinted at a deeper story. Neither had been brave enough to confront until now. The father exhaled shakily as he opened the folded note inside the box, revealing handwriting that Emma recognized from the earlier glimpse. Yet this time she could see the full lines clearly, and the message carried a tone that bordered on both farewell and warning. The girl's mother had written that if anything ever happened to her, their daughter must keep the box safe, because someone might try to take it, and Emma felt her breath catch at the implication behind the carefully measured words. The girl flinched as if the memory of that period still clung to her in fragmented shadows, and Emma understood that the child's silence had not been shaped solely by grief, but by witnessing fear she could never fully articulate. The father clenched the note as though attempting to steady himself against the storm of recollection, revealing that a business partner had recently resurfaced with unsettling inquiries about the family, inquiries that had forced him to tighten security while pretending everything was normal for the girl's sake. Emma realized with growing unease that the 4 bodyguards were not simply protecting a wealthy man from common threats, but guarding a child entangled in a much larger conflict shaped by power, greed, and a betrayal that ran deeper than Emma had initially imagined. The girl pressed her face against Emma's arm as though the words alone stirred memories she had desperately tried to bury, and Emma instinctively placed a protective hand over her shoulder, reinforcing the fragile sense of safety the child clung to. The father clenched the note as though attempting to steady himself against the storm of recollection, revealing that a business partner had recently resurfaced with unsettling inquiries about the family, inquiries that had forced him to tighten security while pretending everything was normal for the girl's sake. Emma saw the torment etched into the lines around his eyes. Realizing that his guilt did not stem solely from emotional distance, but from the devastating truth that he had failed to understand the scope of danger closing in around his child. The girl lifted the photograph once more, her small fingers brushing the image of her mother's face with a fragile tenderness that made Emma's chest tighten, and she whispered something so softly that Emma almost missed it entirely. She said she had seen the man her mother warned about near their home on the day she ran away, and her trembling voice carried a fear too heavy for a child to bear alone. The father's posture crumpled slightly as he processed her confession, and Emma saw his hands tighten into fists at the realization that his daughter had fled not out of anger or rebellion, but because she believed she had to protect herself when no one else could. Emma stepped forward just enough to shield the girl subtly, unsure whether the danger still lingered nearby, or whether the past simply cast such a long shadow that it distorted every safe place she found. The father's voice cracked as he assured his daughter that he would never allow the man to come near her again, yet Emma sensed the uncertainty flickering beneath his promise, revealing a truth he wished he could guarantee more confidently. She felt the girl shift closer, her fragile trust resting entirely on Emma's presence, and the father noticed this with a solemn expression that carried both gratitude and shame. He confessed that security teams had been searching for the girl not simply because she was missing, but because the man had attempted to access confidential records that could reveal her location, leaving them uncertain how far the threat might reach. Emma realized that the diner, with its warm lights and quiet corners, had unknowingly become a temporary refuge for the child during her escape, and the father admitted that her disappearance had been kept quiet to avoid alerting anyone who might be involved. The child's fear made sudden, devastating sense to Emma, who understood that the small wooden box had been her anchor in a world that had shifted violently beneath her feet. The father looked at Emma again with an earnest vulnerability that dismantled whatever remnants of his earlier intimidation remained, and he asked whether she had noticed anyone suspicious near the diner in recent days. Emma hesitated, recalling a few unfamiliar customers who had asked unusual questions about the girl's routines, and she felt a chill trace her spine as she realized the danger might not have been confined to the past. The father's expression hardened in a way that revealed the fierce protective instincts he had suppressed beneath grief and responsibility, and Emma sensed that the stakes surrounding this family had risen far beyond an emotional reunion. She tightened her grip on the girl's shoulder, silently promising that she would not step back now that she understood the real threat, and the child leaned into her with a quiet trust that affirmed the depth of their connection. The father lowered his voice to a tense murmur, telling Emma that he needed her help not only to comfort the girl, but to keep her safe until he could uncover the full extent of the danger. Emma felt the weight of his request settle into her bones, yet she did not flinch, recognizing that the moment she offered kindness to a frightened child was the same moment she stepped willingly into a story larger than she expected. And as the girl placed the wooden box gently in Emma's hands, offering it with a fragile sense of hope, Emma understood that the secrets inside were no longer just relics of a troubled past, but the key to protecting the child from a threat still moving quietly toward them. Emma held the wooden box carefully, feeling its weight settle into her palms with a heaviness that seemed to echo the unspoken fears lingering in the air, and she sensed immediately that accepting it marked a turning point she could never undo. The girl watched her with wide, trembling eyes that shimmered with both fear and fragile trust, as though handing the box over was her way of asking Emma to carry the emotional burden she could no longer shoulder alone. The father observed them silently, torn between gratitude for Emma's presence and the growing awareness that his daughter had bonded with someone outside his reach, which only deepened the guilt burning quietly behind his controlled demeanor. Emma opened the lid slightly, just enough to confirm the box contained more than sentimental remnants, and she noticed how the edges of the note were worn from repeated handling, suggesting the child had clung to it for strength during moments far darker than she was able to articulate. As she traced the faint scratches on the wood, she realized the girl had likely spent hours fidgeting with the carving whenever fear tightened around her chest, carving invisible grooves into her memory while trying to survive something far larger than her small world could comprehend. The father drew closer with hesitant steps, his expression tense yet pleading, as though he wanted to ask Emma what she intended to do with the box, but feared he had forfeited the right to question her decisions. The girl shifted closer to Emma, gently brushing against her hip, and Emma responded by resting a steadying hand on the child's shoulder, creating a protective barrier that did not exclude the father but reminded him how fragile the moment remained. He asked quietly whether the girl had shown any symptoms of distress during the mornings she spent at the diner, and Emma explained that her silence was not numbness, but a shield built from instances of fear layered over grief, creating emotional armor too heavy for a child to carry for long. The father's eyes darkened as he absorbed her words, and Emma sensed that something inside him was unraveling in slow, painful increments, revealing the weariness beneath his authoritative exterior. A sudden shift in the diner's atmosphere pulled Emma's attention toward the window, where she noticed a black sedan lingering across the street, idling in a way that suggested watching rather than waiting, and a cold ripple of unease threaded its way down her spine. She gently asked the father whether he recognized the vehicle, and his expression tightened with immediate suspicion, confirming that the danger circling their small group was not merely a ghost from the past, but a present threat drawing dangerously near. The girl sensed the shift and gripped Emma's apron more tightly, her small shoulders trembling as she peeked toward the glass, with the fearful recognition of someone who had already learned to identify danger from the slightest cues. Emma stepped slightly in front of the child, instinctively shielding her from the sight, and she met the father's gaze with a firmness that indicated she would not let anyone harm the child, regardless of the circumstances pulling them into this tangled conflict. The father placed a reassuring hand near his daughter's back, though he did not touch her directly, offering quiet reassurance that he was aware of the threat and prepared to act, even if the girl was not ready to accept his protection fully. His voice softened as he told Emma that the sedan resembled one used by the associate who had threatened his family, though he admitted he could not confirm without approaching the vehicle or alerting security. Emma noticed a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a glimpse of the father he could have been if grief had not hardened him, and she understood that the emotional distance between him and his daughter was not rooted in apathy, but in a wound he had never learned to heal. The girl tugged gently at his sleeve, offering the smallest invitation for him to stand nearer, and Emma felt the tension ease just enough for a quiet breath of hope to slip between them. The father responded by kneeling once more, speaking softly to his daughter and promising he would not allow anyone to take her from him again, though his voice wavered under the weight of a promise he feared he might not be strong enough to keep alone. Emma sensed an emotional opening forming between them, delicate but undeniably present, and she stepped back slightly to give them space while remaining close enough to provide reassurance if the girl faltered again. The child glanced up at her father with wide, uncertain eyes, searching for truth in his expression, and Emma saw the shift when the man finally allowed his grief to surface, offering his daughter a raw honesty that felt more genuine than anything he had said earlier. Emma saw the torment etched into the lines around his eyes. Realizing that his guilt did not stem solely from emotional distance, but from the devastating truth that he had failed to understand the scope of danger closing in around his child. The girl lifted the photograph once more, her small fingers brushing the image of her mother's face with a fragile tenderness that made Emma's chest tighten, and she whispered something so softly that Emma almost missed it entirely. She placed her small hand in his with hesitant trust, and he closed his fingers around hers gently, as though protecting a fragile truth that had resurfaced after being buried beneath years of unspoken pain. Emma felt the shift like a gentle tremor through the room, signaling the moment a father and daughter began rebuilding something that had nearly been destroyed. He confessed that losing her mother had left him unable to understand how to comfort a child who reminded him so vividly of the person he had failed to protect, and he apologized for the moments he allowed fear to disguise itself as distance. The girl leaned toward him tentatively, and Emma watched the father extend his hand with trembling patience, allowing the child to decide whether she was ready to accept the gesture. And as the father rose slowly with his daughter's hand still in his, Emma realized she had stepped into a role none of them had anticipated: protector, witness, and quiet anchor in a storm that had only just begun to reveal its reach. The tension inside the diner hovered like a storm about to breach its containment. Yet Emma sensed the narrative threads stretching far beyond the small space where father and daughter clung to a fragile reconciliation, and she felt the world outside tightening its grip around them with unnerving precision. The black sedan remained idling across the street, its tinted windows concealing whatever eyes watched the diner's entrance, and the quiet hum of its engine vibrated with a patience that carried more threat than any visible weapon. The father's jaw tensed as he observed the car, and Emma recognized the barely controlled fury beneath his expression, a mixture of fear for his child and anger at the realization that danger had followed them even into a place meant to offer morning solace. Yet the threat remained outside the window, its presence sharpening the emotional stakes, reminding Emma that the fragile reconnection unfolding before her could still be torn apart by forces beyond their control. She straightened her shoulders, preparing herself for whatever danger might follow, determined to stand between the child and anyone seeking to harm her, regardless of the cost. Emma watched him carefully, noting how he attempted to shield his daughter from the severity of his tone, while simultaneously ensuring she remained within arm's reach, revealing a battle between control and desperation that he had not yet fully learned to navigate. The girl clung to Emma's apron but kept her eyes on her father, sensing the shift in his demeanor and growing increasingly aware that the threat surrounding them was not a distant echo, but a present, persistent shadow. While Emma steadied the girl with a gentle hand, the father's voice sharpened as he instructed his security team to track the sedan, verify its owner, and cross-referenced the vehicle with anyone associated with the man who had threatened their family. His commands carried an authority forged through years of navigating high-stakes environments where a single misstep could unravel an empire. Yet Emma could see the cracks forming beneath the surface, revealing a man who feared failure most when it involved the people he loved. She watched his composure flicker when the security team confirmed the car was unregistered and likely rented under a false identity, reinforcing the suspicion that someone was deliberately trying to track his movements without drawing attention. Emma placed herself slightly between the girl and the window, aware that the child's small body trembled with each passing second the sedan remained outside, and she offered a soft reassurance that drew the girl closer in search of safety. The father turned to them, his features momentarily softened by gratitude, yet his eyes quickly hardened again as he informed Emma that they needed to leave the diner immediately before the surveillance vehicle made a move. Emma nodded slowly, understanding the need for urgency, though she could not shake the feeling that the danger was not merely following them but closing in from multiple directions like a tightening net. As the father guided his daughter gently toward the far end of the diner, Emma noticed something subtle shift in the girl's expression. A brief moment of resolve breaking through her fear, as though she understood more about the threat than she had previously revealed. The child glanced at the wooden box in Emma's hands, and then up at her father, her gaze steady despite the tremble in her shoulders, and Emma sensed she was preparing herself to confront memories she had long suppressed. The father noticed the girl's sudden seriousness and paused, kneeling beside her with a gentleness that belied the urgency of their situation, and he asked softly whether she remembered anything else from the day she ran away. The girl hesitated before nodding slowly, and Emma watched the father brace himself for an answer that might carry more danger than comfort. The child whispered that she had seen the man her mother feared speaking to one of her father's senior advisors near their home, and Emma felt a cold realization settle inside the room, as the father's expression twisted with a mixture of betrayal and dawning clarity. He clenched his fists as the girl continued, explaining that she had heard them arguing about documents and someone not cooperating, words that had frightened her enough to hide behind the stairs and memorize details she did not fully understand at the time. Emma could see the father's breathing change as he processed his daughter's fragmented memories, realizing the betrayal was not confined to an external threat, but rooted deeply within the inner circle he had once trusted without question. He whispered a curse under his breath, then steadied himself before assuring his daughter that she had done nothing wrong, though the strain in his voice revealed the magnitude of the revelation weighing on him. Emma recognized the look in his eyes, one of a man piecing together a dangerous puzzle whose edges were lined with deception, greed, and personal loss, and she understood that the threat hunting their family was not merely opportunistic but strategic and deeply embedded. The father stood slowly, his expression sharpening into the steel-like focus of someone preparing to engage in a confrontation he had avoided for far too long, and Emma realized this moment marked the transition between emotional vulnerability and strategic retaliation. The girl sensed the shift as well and reached for Emma's hand, grounding herself in the presence that had offered her comfort throughout the chaos. Emma squeezed her hand gently, aware that the child needed stability more than explanations, especially as the father prepared to dismantle a threat that had extended far beyond their home and infiltrated the very heart of his company. He turned toward Emma with a mixture of determination and unease, quietly acknowledging that the danger was now too deeply intertwined with his professional world to ignore any longer, and he admitted he needed to confront the betrayal head-on. His honesty carried a sincerity that softened the sharp edges of the moment, and Emma realized that he was not merely preparing to protect his daughter physically, but to rebuild the safety she had lost emotionally. The man glanced once more at the sedan, which had begun to inch forward as though testing the boundaries of its concealment, and Emma saw his jaw tighten into a resolute decision that carried the promise of action. Emma held the girl close as the father signaled for his team to secure the perimeter, and she understood instinctively that the next steps would propel them into a larger conflict where truth, power, and loyalty would be tested in ways none of them were prepared for. The girl clung to Emma with a quiet trembling that revealed both fear and an emerging bravery she had not yet recognized within herself, and Emma felt a fierce resolve rise in her chest, determining to protect the child no matter what shadows followed them beyond the diner's warm lights. As the father gently took his daughter's hand and nodded for Emma to follow, the sedan's engine revved softly, signaling that the threat was no longer content to watch from a distance. Emma stepped forward with a steady breath, holding the wooden box securely, understanding that its contents might hold answers capable of shifting the balance between danger and safety. And in that moment, she realized the story had reached a point where escaping the threat was no longer enough. They now had to uncover its source before it swallowed them completely. As they prepared to leave the diner, Emma felt a palpable shift in the air, an almost electric pressure signaling that whatever had been lurking in the shadows was now inching decisively closer, narrowing the space between pursuit and confrontation in a way that made her chest tighten with instinctive urgency. The girl squeezed Emma's hand with a trembling desperation that exposed how deeply the threat had rooted itself in her young mind, and Emma steadied her grip, silently promising she wouldn't let the child face any of this alone. The father glanced toward the street again, his expression carved with a cold clarity that suggested he had moved from fear to strategy, understanding that the situation had crossed a threshold where waiting was no longer an option. His security team arrived in 2 unmarked SUVs, moving with swift precision as they formed a protective perimeter around the diner's entrance. Their movements quiet, yet undeniably purposeful, as though they had rehearsed for moments like this countless times. Emma felt the girl's pulse race beneath her fingers, while the father remained unnervingly composed, issuing instructions into his earpiece with a calm intensity that betrayed the underlying fear anchoring every decision he made. She realized he was no longer trying to maintain appearances or shield his daughter from the reality of their situation. Instead, he was preparing for a battle he now fully understood could no longer be postponed. The sedan across the street finally pulled away, but instead of offering relief, its departure intensified the dread pooling in Emma's stomach, because the way it retreated slow and deliberate felt more like repositioning than withdrawal. The father's jaw clenched as he watched the taillights disappear, and he muttered that the man hunting them was not working alone, implying a network of influence and access that reached far deeper than Emma had imagined. The girl buried her face briefly against Emma's side as though the fading sedan carried echoes of memories she wished she could erase, memories shaped by threats, arguments, and fragments of her mother's warnings that had remained unresolved since the night everything unraveled. As they stepped outside, Emma noticed one of the father's security officers exchange a troubled glance with him, quietly reporting that someone had attempted to breach the company's internal data servers earlier that morning, suggesting the pursuit was not limited to physical surveillance, but extended into digital infiltration. The father stiffened at the news, his entire posture tightening with the realization that the threat was not only closing in on them geographically, but also attempting to dismantle his defenses from within. Emma sensed the girl watching her father with wide, frightened eyes, recognizing his shift in demeanor and understanding instinctively that the danger surrounding them was now far more complex than she had been told. The convoy turned onto a quieter road leading toward the edge of the city, where the father explained he had arranged a secure location for them to regroup and access whatever evidence remained untouched by the internal breach. Emma sensed the girl studying her father's profile with a mixture of admiration and uncertainty, gradually recognizing him not as the distant figure who failed to understand her grief, but as a man wrestling his way toward becoming the parent she needed. The father joined them, his presence filling the interior with a tense calmness as he closed the door and signaled the convoy to move. As the vehicles pulled away from the diner, Emma observed the father's expression transform into something far more pained than before, as though he were replaying every missed moment, every warning he had ignored, every sign that someone close to him had been sowing the seeds of this threat long before the danger reached his daughter. The girl turned her gaze toward him with quiet curiosity, sensing his internal unraveling, and Emma saw the man struggle to maintain a semblance of stability for her sake, even while his mind raced through the implications of the intelligence his security team had just uncovered. His voice softened when he explained that there had been other signs, subtle manipulations in financial reports, missing documents, and confidential files being leaked. But he had dismissed them as routine corporate sabotage rather than the prelude to something far more personal and malicious. Emma listened intently, piecing together the fragments of betrayal that had disrupted their lives, and she realized with a sharp shiver that someone powerful, cunning, and deeply motivated had been orchestrating events with calculated precision, drawing closer each time the father hesitated to act. The girl leaned her head against Emma's arm, close enough that Emma could feel the child's heartbeat fluttering like a small bird trapped inside a tightening cage, and she wrapped an arm around her gently, offering stability where the world around them offered only confusion. The father noticed the interaction and exhaled a shaky breath, humbled by how effortlessly Emma provided comfort he had spent months unable to give. Emma stepped forward with a steady breath, holding the wooden box securely, understanding that its contents might hold answers capable of shifting the balance between danger and safety. And in that moment, she realized the story had reached a point where escaping the threat was no longer enough. They now had to uncover its source before it swallowed them completely. As they stepped outside, Emma noticed one of the father's security officers exchange a troubled glance with him, quietly reporting that someone had attempted to breach the company's internal data servers earlier that morning, suggesting the pursuit was not limited to physical surveillance, but extended into digital infiltration. He murmured that his late wife had tried to warn him, leaving clues he had been too stubborn or too blinded by obligations to interpret correctly, and Emma felt a hollow ache in her chest as she realized how deeply his regret ran beneath the surface. The girl lifted the box gently, brushing her fingers over the carved edges, and whispered that she remembered her mother telling her to keep it safe because the truth protects itself only when the right hands hold it. Ori, Emma tightened her embrace around the child, feeling the weight of those words settle into her bones, knowing instinctively that whatever lay ahead would demand more courage than any of them had yet shown. The father met her gaze with a rare vulnerability, acknowledging silently that they were crossing into a chapter where survival depended not on his wealth or influence, but on their willingness to trust each other through the storm approaching. And as the convoy disappeared into the quiet stretch of road, Emma understood they were no longer running from danger. They were moving toward the truth that danger had tried desperately to bury. The convoy moved deeper into the city's outskirts, weaving through quiet industrial streets where the air felt heavier, as though the shadows themselves were preparing for whatever confrontation awaited them once they reached the father's secure facility. Emma watched the girl's small hands tighten around the wooden box with each passing block, sensing that the child felt the approaching shift even before any of them acknowledged it aloud. The father remained silent beside them, his expression carved with steely focus and underlying dread, as if piecing together the final fragments of a truth he had long feared to face directly. Just as the lead SUV approached the final intersection before their intended destination, Emma noticed a sudden break in the rhythm of the convoy, a slight hesitation from the driver that telegraphed an unseen threat gathering ahead. The father leaned forward sharply, sensing the shift, and demanded to know why they were slowing down, his tone tightening with an urgent fear that prickled beneath the surface. The girl buried her face briefly against Emma's side as though the fading sedan carried echoes of memories she wished she could erase, memories shaped by threats, arguments, and fragments of her mother's warnings that had remained unresolved since the night everything unraveled. The girl shrank closer to Emma, trembling as though she recognized something about the car's presence, and Emma instinctively wrapped her arms around the child, grounding her against the icy dread that seeped through the vehicle. The father immediately ordered the security team to maintain formation, but the urgency lacing his voice betrayed the fear, igniting in his chest as he realized the confrontation he had hoped to delay was now unfolding directly in front of them. The SUV jerked to a stop, and simultaneously 2 more cars emerged from the alleys on either side, converging with predatory precision that trapped the convoy in an unyielding triangle of metal and intent. The father cursed under his breath, understanding instantly that this was no random ambush but a meticulously orchestrated maneuver designed to force him into a confrontation he had desperately tried to avoid. Emma clutched the girl tightly, feeling the child's heartbeat thundering against her ribs like a trapped bird fighting the confines of its tiny cage, and she whispered reassurances despite the growing terror curling inside her chest. She shifted her weight slightly, stepping forward so deliberately that even the security officers paused, surprised by the unexpected presence of a waitress challenging the man responsible for orchestrating their nightmare. His voice softened when he explained that there had been other signs, subtle manipulations in financial reports, missing documents, and confidential files being leaked. But he had dismissed them as routine corporate sabotage rather than the prelude to something far more personal and malicious. The man approached with deliberate calm, his expression blending smugness with cold satisfaction, as though he took pleasure in knowing he had maneuvered the family into a trap they could not evade. The father stepped out of the SUV with furious restraint, flanked by security, shielding Emma and his daughter with his body, even as he confronted the threat head-on with a level of courage forged from equal parts guilt and determination. His voice carried through the tense silence, demanding to know what the man wanted, although the trembling vein in his jaw betrayed the desperation roiling beneath his controlled exterior. Emma remained inside with the girl pressed tightly to her, watching through the open door as the confrontation unfolded under the harsh glow of flickering streetlights, each movement sharpening the tension until it felt almost unbearable. The man approached with deliberate calm, his expression blending smugness with cold satisfaction, as though he took pleasure in knowing he had maneuvered the family into a trap they could not evade. The father stepped out of the SUV with furious restraint, flanked by security, shielding Emma and his daughter with his body, even as he confronted the threat head-on with a level of courage forged from equal parts guilt and determination. The man smirked when he noticed the father's anger, explaining with icy confidence that he had grown tired of waiting for cooperation and decided it was time to persuade the family more directly. The father's security team tightened their formation, preparing to intervene, but the man simply lifted a hand, revealing a small device that pulsed with a chilling signal of power and threat, suggesting leverage far more dangerous than simple intimidation. The man's smile widened, dripping with the satisfaction of knowing he held the advantage, and he stepped closer to the father with a confidence sharpened by betrayal that had been brewing long before this night. Emma tightened her hold on the girl, pulling her deeper into her arms as the child began to shake uncontrollably, whispering broken fragments of memory that painted a haunting picture of threats exchanged, whispers overheard, and secrets that had been buried beneath layers of corporate deceit and familial grief. The father heard the girl's murmured words and turned sharply, his eyes wide with anguish, realizing she had witnessed far more than he ever knew, and the weight of that truth shattered whatever illusion of control he had clung to during the chase. Emma felt tears prick her eyes as she held the child, understanding now that this ambush was not merely a power play, it was a reckoning. The man used the moment of emotional collapse to press his advantage, stepping closer until he stood only a few feet away, his expression cold and victorious as he delivered the ultimatum he had been building toward with relentless precision. He told the father that the girl had seen something she was never supposed to witness, and unless the father surrendered specific documents before midnight, he would ensure the family faced consequences far beyond emotional harm. Emma felt a surge of fury ignite within her as the child whimpered at the man's familiar voice, clutching her apron with desperate claws of terror, and she understood with sudden clarity that the man had become the embodiment of every nightmare the girl carried inside her fragile heart. The father's expression collapsed into a mixture of rage and torment as he realized the full extent of the threat looming over them, and Emma saw him finally break through the last of his emotional barriers, revealing the raw, unfiltered fear of a parent determined to protect his child at any cost. The man noticed the shift and leaned forward with venomous satisfaction, oblivious to the protective fire building inside the once fractured father, who now stood fully aligned with his purpose. The man used the moment of emotional collapse to press his advantage, stepping closer until he stood only a few feet away, his expression cold and victorious as he delivered the ultimatum he had been building toward with relentless precision. He told the father that the girl had seen something she was never supposed to witness, and unless the father surrendered specific documents before midnight, he would ensure the family faced consequences far beyond emotional harm. Emma felt a surge of fury ignite within her as the child whimpered at the man's familiar voice, clutching her apron with desperate claws of terror, and she understood with sudden clarity that the man had become the embodiment of every nightmare the girl carried inside her fragile heart. Emma felt a surge of fury ignite within her as the child whimpered at the man's familiar voice, clutching her apron with desperate claws of terror, and she understood with sudden clarity that the man had become the embodiment of every nightmare the girl carried inside her fragile heart. She shifted her weight slightly, stepping forward so deliberately that even the security officers paused, surprised by the unexpected presence of a waitress challenging the man responsible for orchestrating their nightmare. The antagonist turned his cold gaze toward her, clearly amused by the notion that someone so ordinary would dare insert herself into a conflict crafted at the highest levels of corporate treachery. Yet Emma held his stare with a calmness that felt anchored to something deeper than fear. She spoke slowly, her voice steady and precise, telling him that threatening a frightened child to obtain leverage revealed not intelligence but cowardice, and the father inhaled sharply at the boldness woven through her words. The girl clung to Emma's apron, peering out with wide eyes, sensing the sudden shift in emotional power as Emma's unwavering composure began to puncture the antagonist's overconfidence. The man smirked, dismissing her as irrelevant, but Emma refused to retreat, raising her chin and reminding him that his entire strategy depended on fear he no longer controlled, because the truth written by the girl's mother had survived every attempt to silence it. She told him the wooden box contained copies of the documents he believed were his only leverage, and she deliberately let the implication hang in the air long enough for doubt to slice through his confidence. The father turned his gaze sharply toward Emma, startled by the precision in her voice, and for the first time, he realized she understood the unfolding battle with greater emotional clarity than any executive strategist he had ever hired. The antagonist stepped closer, trying to reassert dominance through proximity, yet Emma remained motionless, grounding herself in the child's small hand gripping her apron with desperate trust. The convoy's security team reacted swiftly, stepping out with protective formation as they assessed the growing threat. But Emma noticed the approaching figures carried themselves with the unhurried confidence of men who believed the outcome was already predetermined. The father's eyes widened in recognition as Emma subtly referenced the mother's pattern of doubling information, a habit he remembered only now that someone else had spoken it aloud, and the antagonist's expression flickered with the first trace of genuine panic. Emma stepped forward another inch, placing herself fully between the girl and the threat, and reminded the man that even if he harmed them, the truth would already be moving toward the authorities, ensuring his downfall long before he could escape the consequences. Her voice carried an unshakable certainty that pierced the manufactured intimidation thickening the air, and the antagonist hesitated long enough for Emma to sense the first crack forming in his manipulative facade. The security detail subtly shifted in response to her words, emboldened by the quiet resolve radiating from her stance, and the father felt the unfamiliar sensation of hope stirring inside him, guided by the courage of someone whose life had never intersected with power until this moment. The antagonist attempted to recover, insisting that she was bluffing, yet Emma tilted her head slightly, repeating the exact phrase the girl's mother had written in the note. Truth protects itself only when the right hands hold it, and the man's confidence fractured visibly, revealing that he recognized the phrase and understood its implications. Emma explained that the girl's mother had suspected him long before her death and had entrusted her daughter with the box because she knew her husband might not see the betrayal coming in time. Every word Emma spoke drew the girl closer to her father emotionally, as though the truth emerging from Emma's calm strength bridged years of pain between them. The father finally stepped forward beside Emma, no longer paralyzed by guilt or fear, his voice steadying, as he repeated that the documents were worthless, as leverage because the truth had already begun unraveling the antagonist's scheme. He declared that his legal team, investigators, and outside advisors had been alerted earlier that day when the first data breach was attempted, and Emma noticed the antagonist's hand tighten around the device he held, betraying the fear he attempted to conceal. The girl reached out for her father's sleeve, offering the smallest gesture of trust, and the father responded by placing a protective hand over hers, drawing courage from the bond rekindling between them. Emma sensed the moment when the power dynamic shifted completely, the moment when the antagonist realized intimidation no longer granted him control, because both father and daughter were anchored to a truth that survived beyond his reach. She stepped closer to him, lowering her voice to a near whisper, telling him that the wooden box contained not fear but legacy, love, and foresight, none of which he possessed the strength to manipulate. The man's face contorted with a mixture of fury and disbelief, and he stepped back unconsciously, revealing for the first time that her quiet defiance had pushed him off balance in a way he had never anticipated. The father signaled his security team with a decisive nod, instructing them to detain the antagonist until authorities arrived, and Emma held the girl tightly as the tension dissolved into a chaotic but controlled flurry of movement. The girl pressed her face against Emma's chest, her small body trembling with relief as she realized the danger was finally losing its grip on her fragile world, and Emma whispered softly that she was safe now, truly safe, because she had given her truth to the right hands. The father knelt beside them, his voice breaking as he thanked Emma with a sincerity forged from the depths of a fear he had finally overcome, and Emma felt the weight of his gratitude settle into her heart like a quiet, unexpected warmth. And as the antagonist was forced to his knees, his power dismantled not by violence but by steady courage and unshakable humanity, Emma understood that the calm within her had become the turning point. None of them had seen coming proof that strength did not always roar. Sometimes it stood quietly between a child and the darkness until the darkness finally broke. As the authorities approached and the antagonist was restrained with a mixture of force and reluctant humiliation, Emma felt the tension finally loosen its grip on the air, allowing space for a quieter, heavier emotion to settle across the scene like the soft echo of an ending none of them had been prepared to face. The girl clung to her father's sleeve with trembling fingers, seeking reassurance in the one person she had spent so long fearing she had lost. And Emma watched the father kneel with a gentleness that revealed the deep, unspoken cracks within him slowly beginning to mend. His eyes brimmed with a grief so raw and unfiltered that even the hardened security officers seemed to look away, giving him a moment of private reckoning in the middle of a public collapse. The man's smile widened, dripping with the satisfaction of knowing he held the advantage, and he stepped closer to the father with a confidence sharpened by betrayal that had been brewing long before this night. Emma felt her chest tighten with an emotion she had not anticipated, realizing she had become the thread stitching together the fractured pieces of lives far removed from her own. She approached gently, placing a light hand on the girl's back, grounding her in the moment as the child shifted slightly to look at her father with a tenderness that hinted at newfound hope. The father continued speaking, his words thick with regret as he confessed that he had underestimated the danger whispering around their home, blinded by loyalty to the wrong people and oblivious to the fear that tightened around his daughter each time she saw the man who now knelt in handcuffs. The girl clung to her father's sleeve with trembling fingers, seeking reassurance in the one person she had spent so long fearing she had lost. And Emma watched the father kneel with a gentleness that revealed the deep, unspoken cracks within him slowly beginning to mend. His eyes brimmed with a grief so raw and unfiltered that even the hardened security officers seemed to look away, giving him a moment of private reckoning in the middle of a public collapse. The man's smile widened, dripping with the satisfaction of knowing he held the advantage, and he stepped closer to the father with a confidence sharpened by betrayal that had been brewing long before this night. The father continued speaking, his words thick with regret as he confessed that he had underestimated the danger whispering around their home, blinded by loyalty to the wrong people and oblivious to the fear that tightened around his daughter each time she saw the man who now knelt in handcuffs. Emma stepped back slightly to give them space, though her presence remained a quiet anchor nearby, and she watched the father pull his daughter gently into his arms, with a care that suggested he feared she might disappear if he held her too tightly. The father continued speaking, his words thick with regret, as he confessed that he had underestimated the danger whispering around their home, blinded by loyalty to the wrong people and oblivious to the fear that tightened around his daughter each time she saw the man who now knelt in handcuffs. He whispered that her mother had asked him to protect their daughter above everything else, but he had allowed grief to consume him so entirely that he forgot how to be present, how to listen, and how to see the world through the small, frightened eyes of the child who depended on him. The girl leaned into him slowly, her body easing into the safety of his embrace, and Emma sensed that this fragile moment of trust carried more healing than any grand gesture could ever offer. Emma felt her chest tighten with an emotion she had not anticipated, realizing she had become the thread stitching together the fractured pieces of lives far removed from her own. She approached gently, placing a light hand on the girl's back, grounding her in the moment as the child shifted slightly to look at her father with a tenderness that hinted at newfound hope. He whispered that her mother had asked him to protect their daughter above everything else, but he had allowed grief to consume him so entirely that he forgot how to be present, how to listen, and how to see the world through the small, frightened eyes of the child who depended on him. The girl leaned into him slowly, her body easing into the safety of his embrace, and Emma sensed that this fragile moment of trust carried more healing than any grand gesture could ever offer. The girl lifted the wooden box toward Emma again, but this time she placed it between herself and her father, as though offering it not as a shield but as a bridge between their worlds. The father gently took the box, tracing the carved lines with reverent fingers, and whispered that he now understood why his wife had left it behind, because she had known the truth he needed to face, and she had trusted their daughter to carry that truth until he was finally ready to confront it. His voice softened as he admitted he had been afraid to open the box because he feared it would expose his failings more than any external threat ever could. Emma saw the girl lean closer, encouraging him with a small nod, and the father exhaled a shaky breath before opening the box again, not with fear this time, but with acceptance. The father watched the exchange with softened eyes, understanding the significance of the gesture, and he quietly offered Emma his support in return, explaining that if she ever needed help, medical assistance for her family, financial, his daughter close, with a gentleness shaped by newfound humility, and Emma watched the pair with quiet admiration, sensing that something essential had shifted within both of them, stitching their fractured bond back together with threads woven from honesty and shared vulnerability. Emma shook her head gently, insisting she had simply been in the right place at the right time, though the father countered with quiet conviction that compassion was never accidental and that her presence had changed the course of their lives in ways she might never fully understand. The girl reached for Emma then, wrapping her arms around her with surprising firmness, and Emma returned the embrace with a tenderness that mirrored the child's unspoken gratitude. The father watched the exchange with softened eyes, understanding the significance of the gesture, and he quietly offered Emma his support in return, explaining that if she ever needed help, medical assistance for her family, financial relief, or even a fresh start, he would ensure she received it without question or hesitation. The father watched the exchange with softened eyes, understanding the significance of the gesture, and he quietly offered Emma his support in return, explaining that if she ever needed help, medical assistance for her family, financial relief, or even a fresh start, he would ensure she received it without question or hesitation. He nodded with genuine remorse and renewed determination, promising aloud that he would rebuild their home with patience, love, and the willingness to listen even when silence made the truth harder to hear. The girl squeezed his hand, signaling her belief in his promise, and Emma felt a quiet pride swell within her as she imagined the life the two of them would create moving forward. One anchored not in wealth or power, but in understanding forged from shared pain and fragile hope. Her words struck him with visible impact, and he shifted his stance, as though steadying himself against the undeniable truth threading through her explanation. He touched the box gently, confessing in a strained whisper that the girl's mother had been the one who understood her heart, and without her presence he had felt like a stranger in his own home.